Ailbhe Ní Ghearbhuigh was born in County Kerry into an Irish-speaking family and was educated in Irish. After receiving her degree from NUI Galway, she lived for several years in France and also spent a period in New York as a Fulbright scholar. In more recent years, she's lived in Galway and now is here in Cork, where she lectures, as I said, at UCC. Her work is often located in the tradition established by Leanne O'Sullivan and the other members of the so-called Inchi generation that came to the fore in the 70s, here in Cork largely. Biddy Jenkinson is also mentioned as an influence, but Ailbhe's distinctive voice is just that. And she has distinguished herself as an observer, among other things, of urban life and as a citizen of cities and towns, not just in Ireland, but in the US and France and elsewhere, including obviously Galway and also Cork. Her first collection was published in 2008, and in 2012 she won the O'Neill Poetry Prize. Her poem Fhile was chosen as the Ireland's EU presidency poem in 2013 and shortlisted for the 2015 RTE Poem for Ireland competition. A second book, Tost, agus, Allagar, was published in 2016 by Coisceim, and a bilingual collection, which is out here for sale, The Coast Road, was published in late 2016 by the Gallery Press, which includes English translations by, I think it's 13 poets of Ailbhe's work. And here's something maybe you didn't know. Ailbhe Ní Ghearbhuigh was recently presented with Parnell's walking stick. This is true, cut by Charles Stuart Parnell himself in Avondale in 1889. The stick has a rich literary history. It came into the possession of Brinsley McNamara, who in turn gave it to the poet W.R. Rogers. It was passed on from him to Conor Cruise O'Brien, who conferred it on Seamus Heaney. In 1998, Seamus Heaney bestowed it on to Nuala Ní Ghearbhuigh, and it was Nuala who gave it to Ailbhe last year in Poetry Ireland. Leanne O'Sullivan was born on the Beara Peninsula in West Cork and studied also at UCC, where she now works as a lecturer in poetry at the School of English. Leanne enjoyed early success, very early success with her poetry, garnering a range of prizes even before her first book, Waiting for My Clothes, was published by Bloodaxe, when Leanne was just 21 years of age. She's the author of 4 collections of poetry and the recipient of numerous prestigious honours, including the Rooney Prize and the Lawrence O'Shaughnessy Award. The latest piece of silverware to land on her mantelpiece is the Farmgate Market Cafe National Poetry Award, which was awarded to Leanne against stiff competition earlier this week here in Cork. This was for her latest book, A Quarter of an Hour, which returns in many ways to her earlier poetry of reflection and heightened self-awareness. This time amid a life and near-death struggle with the illness of an intensely loved one, her husband, Andrew, who's also a member of the UCC team. Leanne maintains strong ties with her dream hoard in Beara, where myth, history, family and landscape all mix to form an engaging and fulfilling whole, a poetry that is richly personally political and always delivered in terms that are artful and engaging. So Ailbhe's going to read first and then followed by Leanne. Thank you very much.
How the Story Started by Marie Howe. I was driven toward desire by desire, believing that the fulfillment of that desire was an end. There was no end. Others might have looked into the future and seen a shape inside the coming years, a house, a child, a man who might be a help. I saw his back bent over what he was working on, the back of his neck, how he stood in his sneakers and wanted to eat him. How could I see another person? I mean, who he was, apart from me, apart from that. When you live in a place for a long time, when the time comes to leave it, it can feel like kind of a betrayal, or that you're leaving a lover. So this is my poem to Galway called X, and it's translated by Mona Gork. Galway, yeah, my lover of old, I remember you. Rain slobbering on my face, giddy winds all over me. See me there in my young day at the cross of Teenachtan and Technicolor, where Damnick Street was America, a strip club wedged between the Christian Cafe and Club Oris na Gael. There I was, and will be again, making sense, or trying to, of the heart and the mouth, the tongue ablaze, all those promises. Galway, it was years ago. It's a cold return, it always is, to a town with nothing to show for itself, but wet-faced, wind-stripped ghosts. X. Behuma Leanne O'Sullivan, Ailbhe, fóg the bhaistech mo gnuis, chumil the scríab mo cholin is the luch. Da henny is me héine de chud sráidine, os cór Teenachtan, Chalon the Techna Rate. Medica the Bashra Diamonic, Uachtarach gus Iachtarach, strip club, Cafe Criasby, Club Oris na Gael. Tá me tatchult de nacht ga haurisach, an dúil víltach úd tráte a had váilte. Ba liamhu úr de bhain a Ailbhe, nach voor an Fhile valin a daibh si, is nach at. This is a poem called Tuathal, and the word Tuathal in Irish has several different meanings. You take a turn to the left, or towards the north, or if you go in the wrong direction, you're going Tuathal. There's also something kind of clumsy. If you're Tuathal, you're kind of clumsy. And it's possibly also the most expensive poem I've ever written, because it's based on a time when I made a concertina of the front of my car. And it's translated by Leanne O'Sullivan as anti-clockwise. I took the coast road on the way to the well, head starved and ravenous. I spat at the honeycomb, the bread and wine, desiring only hazel. Blindsided, I jolted when the car clipped the edge and spun anti-clockwise. Unweighted in darkness, there was nothing else. I woke mud-soaked at the mouth of the Shannon. I tell people I saw O'Toole's castle, that O'Toole himself has been there in the riverbed. And maybe I did. And maybe it was the goddess that held me, those small, strong hands that gripped my neck. Tuathal. Mar rial chun an tabhairt, ras bóthar an chósta go créas agante. Youthíos de rán, den bhíon, don gríthar mele, níor hauntíos ach an caul. Frabas as ma vachnaf, nuair a skin ma chart den giúis is chassi, timpel tuhalach, ní raibh fhac fún. Rúsíos sa bhairt I méal na sinne, go tram dhéagach san isce. Deirem na daine go bhaca caisleán I thuhal, is an tuhalach féin sa ghrinne. Is beidir go bhaca. Ach nadidir ar a bhí baclan an bhan dé a bhí faran san ann, nu a lábha beaga tama in raim scórnaí. This is called Scéala ón Itir, translated by Billy Ramsell as Lighthouse Story. The man who manned the big height lighthouse Or perhaps it's Helvik where he was stationed. Put down such seasons of silence, he stopped hearing altogether. The specialists assembled, the quacks, the healing maruchas, with every conceivable treatment, but remission there came none. The hearing, the unhearing, was entangled so deeply down in his ear canals, it deafened him forever. Perhaps during his lighthouse confinement, his skull was loaded with noise, with stampeding apprehensions, with every wreck's consequence. In any event, verb, voice, or vibration never dared his eardrum's threshold again. Scéala ón Iarthar. Bhí fearr I dig solas an ord mhuir. Nú beidir gur gan Helvik a bhí sé. Ach bhí sé chomh sin in a host gur báríoga é. Léag hochtúirí, quacks, is van fasa. Is tugach gach sais leis is liveró, ach beseach níor tháinig ed. Bhí an bhamhre, sáite, chomh sin siar ina chluasa gur duineadh báránda. Nú beidir, agus é tamtathe sa tig solis, gur líonadh a cheann lán de gló, gur gach táin ris muin tóireach de tríd, gur fáid siad thora gach tabiste dó. Ailbhe, focail, fuin ná fáin, níor chúla sé chuige a ríist. I'm interested a lot in kind of the transmission of language from one generation to another, and also language shift from one language to another. And I kind of wrote this, I suppose, about my experience living in New York, and about imagining a Spanish speaker, but I didn't have to imagine. And you know how your mother tongue can become something embarrassing in your teenage years. So I'm going to read the Irish first, Emigrante, and then I'll read the translation by Paul Muldoon. Emigrante. An chéad óirde sa dain uair, bhí fáin irte an ile ní a anam nu. Nu an rud a bhrá lena méir, Cailleach, cuirt luch na graun, muggle canó capel, a raibh an taobh stig de, có bug vín agus mué le hí féin. Nu gur háig go máthir de ceann amach, fuinó gnorde is de bhéig. Hey, chica, qué frío, eh? ¿Dónde está tu chaqueta? Ní raibh uí anis, ach go slugfaí sa fuiteachí, go bara a cín. San irthar sin a féicfol í, as an gré sin a áiscfaí í. Ní bhrisig an dúchas trí na súile go brach. Emigrant. Her very first fall in the new world, her main aim was to call everything by a name. To mark things with her finger, the moss, the wet tree bark, the gloss of a horse chestnut, the innermost part of which had grown as tender moist as her own, till her mom dared to stick her head out of an upstairs window and shout, "Hi, girls, surely you're cold enough. Did you leave home without your muff?" Now her greatest desire was to vanish off the face of the earth, sinking into the mire and leaving not a trace. She would put forth a bud from that patch of earth, out of that same mud undergo a total rebirth. Nothing she carried gene-wise would ever break through her eyes. I spent a couple of months kind of immersing myself in the work of this French poet, Ailbhe Ní Ghearbhuigh, as I was working on a book of her translations, and that's going to come out in May with Cois Life. And it's part of a series of Irish poets translating European poets. So some of the other people involved are Ailbhe Ní Ghearbhuigh, Gabriel Rosenstock, Thomas Maximoy, and Leanne O'Sullivan. So are there any French people here? I'm going to try and read the original French, and then I'll read my translation. I think I'm okay. Un fleuve nous habite. Terré sous notre peau, un fleuve nous habite. Se meut parmi nos membres, monte jusqu'à nos lèvres, plus vif parfois que nos corps qui l'abritent. Combien d'heures éteintes faudra-t-il traverser, de plaines mises à feu, de puits insondables, désoudre combien d'ombres, desserrer bec et griffes, pour pénétrer cette eau dont la quiétude s'enlampe et s'immerger longuement. Rihin Awen Onin. Rihin Awen Onin, Fhile Fhuinar Grican. Glúisin an ascar néag, Airian Godinar Miola. Inis brevere uirante na ar gullen a chudiani. An mó oer gurige Ghearbhuigh Leanne, an mó machare a bhétáil, an mó tobber divigáin. An mó ská rá a lá, gob is crú rá a scuile. Chun dolisteach san iscasa, sa hiúnas gan solas. Agus sin héin a hama, tamil ma fada. I'm going to finish up with two kind of postnatal poems. A bit abstract, I think, maybe. So this is called Crow, and it's translated by Billy Ramsell as Buyer. And I'll read the English first. Buyer. We measure her measuring. Will she come in? Will her carriage pass through the doorframe? We've registered this kind of thing before, uncertainty at the threshold. But no need for her, between two words, to hesitate. She'll be swallowed anyway into this kingdom of heat. There's a scatter of us here already, salmon-eyed and sweating. The coffee in our coffee pots, sweet and ineffectual. A few of us monitor the clock on the wall. But most wouldn't give you spilt milk for the hour, stationed here between drowsiness and roaring. The hunger sucking at us, brain in the ag brain, the matter sipped out of each bone. Oh, how this cursed acoustic titillates and stabs, the whispering and the shrieks and the jibber-jabber, and still she cogitates athwart the door frame. But the only way out for her is to come in. Crow. Ciamid I ag pós an raig si isteach, maid na trucala trí ráma an doris. Chonacamar a le héad rimise, é gintach dar an dáirseach. Ach ní gáde bheith idir gá fórle, slug farí a réanos isteach a riocht se an tasa, tá scata gwyn an sa hana. Súile éisgarin is sin ag chur allis. Tá an café sa fota lag agus bug. Is tá draum ag farag o géir ar an glug. Formhór a gwyn beag bean ar an úr, just ag marachtant ó mail go búr, an tocras ag dúl ar an le fada le stór, an smúr súite as gach knáv. Gló damalta na háit sa ag réaba, cogarní is gabarach de scrécha. Tá sí fós ar an dáirseach ag farag isteach, ach ní léalda siaracha na éon techt as. Some of Bhuichas leis an Munster Literature Centre as an gcuide a bheith so it's a great festival. while I was on maternity leave, and when the baby was very, very small, a very good friend of mine came to visit Angus, and Angus works for the UN, so he's out there everywhere doing amazing things. And this poem is contrasting my experience in the house with his life. And it's translated by Annan Gillis. Cuairteoir, the Visitor. You came to us, you said, from Mazaredan, wearing a thobe, a satchel on your shoulder. You came in spring from Mazaredan, your head spinning tales from near and far, full of more wonder than I'd come upon, that you carried over countless hills and rivers. You were not a hawk nor a kingly man. I was before you in the guise of a girl. Our house windows had no bolts of iron. But you were at ease, letting your words unfurl and bloom, but as they opened, my head and everything in it became gnarled. My field of vision was dark as nightshade, the knot in my tongue like a halter, because another care weighed on me like lead. For you, the great ocean is a drop of water. You cross a border at the blink of an eye. Your soul's fuel is rich as myrrh. I spent time when my mind was fried. I spent time under house arrest. I thought I would roll over and die. But I stayed. You left. Now I'm finding once more a rhythm as the fog slowly lifts. You came, you said, from Mazaredan, and stayed and talked for a time. May you drift in peace across these hills, rivers, oceans, far lands. Cuairteoir. Hánis chuin on down thir, cóta mór Allagar, is mála the rim. Hánis san rach on down thir. Bhí scéalta go leor go dó chian is ó chungar, iad lán le húpas is tuiscint anda, agus chuinead trasna an tóchar. Níor bhí an seachta nó macing rí, níor sparrí ian in óga an tí. Bhí is rót le seandanna I rucht chalín. Bhí siad a chuimhnas ag farsinú, matáine do chud focail is iad ag bláthú. Bhí me cheann is a raibh ag fio ag cumú. Snaim me cheanga nach bhéaltan scuile, cuing München ag cuaram eile, réan mórarc go mór Cailleach. Bréan isce ditse an tagaí mór, trasníon tú tóra I bhata na súl, bros le danama jackard a idú. Bhí is seall fé raid na spaile, bhí is seall marahel agane, thasas go men ceall fasta. Jimig tú is fan a marne, chohíasí is fan siam mar rihin, chlan an cio de réir I chéile. Hánis chuin on down tir, Danish tamil ag córálin, go dé tú slán a an bóthir. Gur mí maithir.
I'm going to start off with the Marie Howe poem as well. I think it was a trip to New York and Strand bookshop with Theo Dorgan and Louis Dupuer in 2015, and I found, I think it was just, she had 3 collections out at that stage and came home full of Marie Howe. And I think what I loved about her was the reversals in her poetry. I grew up in a staunchly Catholic house where, you know, if you didn't believe in the resurrection, you were in trouble, even as a child you're thinking, surely not. But what I loved about her, and continue to adore in her poetry, is the way she brings revelation and extraordinary experience into the everyday. So this is called part of Eve's discussion. It was like the moment when a bird decides not to eat from your hand and flies just before it flies. The moment the rivers seem to still and stop because a storm is coming, but there is no storm. As when 100 starlings lift and bank together before they wheel and drop. Very much like the moment driving on bad ice, when it occurs to you your car could spin just before it slowly begins to spin. Like the moment just before you forgot what it was you were about to say. It was like that, and after that, it was still like that, only all the time. So go out and buy Marie Howard books, and I think she just had her 4th collection. She started publishing in the 80s, and her 4th collection came out last year. So she's a wonderful poet who, gives you permission to take your time and pay attention to what you're doing. So I adore her. So, and if any of our American friends who are here today, give her our best and wish her a speedy recovery. So this is my 2nd time kind of reading this week, and some of you are probably sick to death of hearing me reading from this book. The poems I'm going to read are really preoccupied with memory, and mostly because of, as John mentioned, sickness came into our house about 5 years ago. My husband, Andrew, got very, very sick with an infection in his brain. And he fell into a coma for 3 weeks. And during that time, his temperature rose to 42 degrees. And he had blisters on his ears and on his arms. And they were just covering him with ice packs and trying to save him. And when he woke up, he didn't remember very much. He didn't remember me. He remembered I was somebody very important to him, but couldn't name me. And one striking thing that happened one day, a lot of you have heard the story anyway, but I'll tell it again really briefly. When he was up, and he was in hospital for months and months, and one day I was in with him and I was folding up clothes, and he was eating his meal, on the hospital tray that they wheel in next to you, and he was eating and feeding himself, and he said, babes, you wouldn't think we're 3,000 feet up in the air now, would you? And I said, no, I suppose and I thought now's the time to tell him that because he's an academic and we hadn't told him at that point what had happened to him. And I said, no, do you know what? We're not in a plane. I said, we're in a hospital. And he looked around and he said, yeah. And he said, what hospital? And I said, we're in Cork University Hospital. He said, I think I'd rather be in the bonds, to be honest. a private hospital, not that far. Loads of religious iconography there. Andrew, as Jerry kindly pointed out before the reading, isn't Catholic, and so I think would have found statues of Holy Mary more scary. But I asked him why. I said, no problem, whatever you want. Out of curiosity, why would you like to be in the bonds? And he said, well, I think it might be a more controlled environment. And I said, oh yeah. And he said, yeah, I think they might not have as many wild animals wandering around the hallways. And we had been married for about a year, and I asked his wife, I said, if the doctor comes around here, don't you dare say one word about wild animals wandering around the hallways. And I said, what do you see? And he said, well, foxes and wildcats and some raccoons. He's from North America. And I suppose it was when I came to writing the poems, I was thinking about when he would see these, they stayed for a year and a half, foxes, when he was distressed, when he was upset about something, when he was anxious. Not only could he see them, he could hear them coming up the hallway, and he could smell them. He had a thing called encephalitis, and I've spoken to people who've had strokes, and one other person who had encephalitis. They see animals. One person saw bodies of water that he was trying to get across. So I always felt there was some kind of elemental primal healing that was happening for him. So just before, and also I was thinking about the ways in which our planet is heating up. and we're losing species of plants and animals that we're never going to be able to remember and put back together. So that's a long kind of introduction to the poems that I'm reading. The first one is called The Fox, and just before Andrew got sick we went out for a walk. It was September evening and we came across a little fox who was dead on the road, like freshly, must have been struck by a car, and Andrew picked her up and put her into the side of the road. And when we came back later, again that evening, she had disappeared, and I wondered, had she kind of entered into his imagination? Andrew I always forget to say as well, he did brilliantly, and you know someone as well when you come home and the dishes aren't done and the house is dirty and you want to kill him yourself. So he did very well. So The Fox. We were just returning home when the light began to fade. That gold, quiet brilliance you waited for at the gate, when we crossed the lane for the last time and suddenly came to the open-mouthed body of the fox lying on the road ahead of us. Her tail flared out behind her, her fur all live and glandular in the evening air. The day was still warm along her shoulders, and in the one exploded eye that held a shape you could not recognize, the name of the river folding back along the river, the bright trails, the way to the long grasses, and whatever had passed through there in the night. And before it all vanished into darkness, you had lifted her into your arms and gestured to me and gently set her down like a small fire among the grasses. So soft, you said she could almost pass through you in that light. And what happened next? Did the great pain come? You forget. When we came back the next morning, she was gone. No sign or scent, no brightness in the trails, no memory bearing down. But mine to tell now, with all the clearness of the morning after. You see, by the time sunlight had passed through the last amber and orbit of her eye, we had just been setting out. She had already become part of this story. Andrew is, as John also mentioned, a lecturer in UCC. And he lectures on Spencer, and Andrew is a lovely person and Spencer wasn't really a lovely person. But he was a great writer, and Andrew's favourite book of his is The Fairy Queen, which is a tome of a book. And just as Andrew was going into the coma, he was kind of rambling to himself, and I said, "Where are you?" And he said, "Book 1 of The Fairy Queen." And I said, I wish I paid attention in those lectures, because Andrew taught me The Fairy Queen. But I did go back and read it. And in book, I think it's in book 2 of The Fairy Queen, there's a character, there's a castle which is an allegory for the body, and the knight enters into, I suppose, like the bowels and the stomach, and ascends through the heart area and slowly into the head, which is a grand library that is maintained by a man named Eunestes, which means good memory, and he's an old man, and it's his job to write down the history of the whole world. And he reminds me of my national school teacher, who was a local historian and genealogist, and he put together 3 or 4 volumes called, they're known locally as the Books of the Ancestors. And when I was like a teenager, like when I was in secondary school and I hadn't seen him for a while, and I went to visit, and he took me into his office where he had been gathering all of the information about the families on the peninsula, and it was just floor-to-ceiling bookcases of Ashling copybooks where he had been keeping all of the information. So he was my Eunestes. So Eunestes, and it's in his voice. When I arrived in this country for the first time, I had in my possession only one book, and being almost completely alone, wrote in such detail everything I could remember: the Big Bang, the years of Nestor, the great disasters and disturbances of weather, world ending and world beginning, blue unto great darkness, unto blue again, unto temples and courtyards, unto kingdoms and faltering customs. Not that I fully understood, but in this way I have been useful, have minded how they lived, how they harvested cotton or grain, what seed caught in the amber drop. How once a man might have luckily sensed the danger meant for him, something creeping in the great dark expanse, just before he decided to turn around and come back, find another way. How he must have listened, watched for signs, for trails, or deciphered how a peal of light falling through the trees could mark roughly a way in, the way out again, so that he knew the path in the future must be, which is the reading I try to bear in mind. It's called Autumn. How the autumn dawn burned through the misty broods and settled down in fire. How quickly the sun glittered my shadow. How my shadow cried a moment with joy. A light frost, a vision of light crackling down the maples, down the tinder ash. I was the good thief. I held my love's sweet breath, his beautiful, intelligent gaze. I closed my eyes and he woke inside me. When I saw, he saw the inflamed world. A bird sang deeply from the gutter eaves. When I closed my eyes, I was elsewhere. I walked through the fire of his sleep. When he came home, it was loads of fun. Vocabulary was one of the things that was quite mixed up. It's an incredible experience living with somebody who's learning words again and trying to remember, knowing what the thing is but not knowing what to call it. So this is called Morning Poem, and Andrew's a great gardener. Of course, memory began in the garden, going out to it so early that first morning home. The little bells of the dawn, not yet too loud or too deep. The world around him still only half asleep. Oh, Byzantium, he thought, fingering the spires of the foxgloves and the berries ghosting along the bramble and the beams grown rotten into the ground. The things we have seen, the sweet, accidental parts of our lives stooping largely in their rough matins. Where are we now? Somewhere near him, a stone unsettles itself and a beast in the blue light turns over. What sound do you make to find that? What symbol means nothing at all? So I was thinking about memory and all kinds of memory and all kinds of men who took off for what seemed like 3 days and only to come back 900 years later. And of course, Oisín was one of those. Oisín went away to Tirnanog with Niamh and he thought he was only gone for 3 days. And after what felt like a long weekend, he thought I'd better head back. And the girlfriend's dad said, "You can borrow my horse, but you're not to get off the horse." And Oisín came back to Ireland and saw these people trying to lift a heavy stone, and as a member of the Fhile, he said, "I'll hop off the horse now and help them," and he hopped off the horse and he suddenly aged 900 years. So I saw Oisín as kind of an early Irish immigrant going away and coming back a little bit disillusioned. Oisín. He hesitates before taking Niamh's hand. The water is glittering. His horse is ready, restless in the morning light. He stands on the wide, white shore, looking back at the home place for the last time. He knows the story will change in him as time passes, no matter how well he has learned it, no matter how well he was taught. Love and grief, weeping and singing, believing there was magic in the stones, mountains and rights and sovereignty, always with loss to come, and growing tired among the heather and vetch. Still he thinks, what times we saw, what astonishment. He keeps trying to taste that wholeness but cannot. No matter, he says, looking out towards the ocean, it's almost spring again. Tomorrow I will be living on the island, laughter and birdsong clear from the shore, sunlight giving way to coolness at night. I will have fine things, he says, and perfect skies. I'll just finish up with this last fox poem. And thank you to Pat for the invitation to read with Ailbhe, the wonderful Ailbhe, and to pay tribute as well to Marie Howe.
And John Fitzgerald.
And John Fitzgerald, thank you, John. And always thank you, John. So this is called Fox, and I'd also like to thank my husband for giving me permission to publish these poems, because there are a few of them that are in his voice. Of course, he didn't say these words at the time, but I imagined that he could have said them or felt them. Fox. And the person I think being addressed in the poem is the beloved. Is the fox you see on your evening walk by the river the same one who sits beside me in the garden when I cannot sleep, gazing out from under the bare limbs of the orchard, among the brambles and our tribe of ferns? So I have come to a time in my life when I cannot name one season from another, or remember what the day means to tell me when the sun disappears so early out of the world. I know I am living in the months before I was born, when the maples would burn along the twilight and the animals had all slipped through the last long shadows of the year. It is just like that when I try to call out, and the words I had known forever and by heart drift silently away down the dark lawn. They have vanished and nothing is heard. What I want to say is that the fox is here. She has come so near that I cannot believe it. Her fur all starlit and glittering, warmer than my own skin against the frost. Then not a fox, but a woman where she once had been, sitting beside me on the grass, speaking gently and with a woman's voice. My sweetheart, she whispers into the night, it's time to go back to sleep now. Thank you.
Your own assessment as to whether is it an issue anymore for you?
I think there's often a lot of controversy on the gender question.
Yeah.
There was a Cambridge anthology recently, if I'm not mistaken, edited by Gerald Daw, that neglected to include a lot of women, but on the other side, I mean, the span of years that he set out to tackle was very, very broad. So I'm not making excuses for him, but I think he was attacked for that. And I mean, in a sense, the gender issue I find quite tiresome, actually, because then you have to kind of always say something about gender. But for me personally, I haven't felt that being a woman has held me back in terms of poetry at all. But I recognise that the canon has long been male, and that in teaching at UCC, that it's something that we try to address in class, which is that when we look back at, say, the 17th century poetry, one of the modules I teach, And you have to really look hard for women to include in that course. But they're there, they are there. And I think that I suppose that the responsibility for editing an anthology or indeed organising a festival, that you want to make sure that there's equality.
And I wonder how much responsibility should be laid at the door of the publishing house as well, who are choosing, editors and working with editors. And in fairness, he did go to a symposium afterwards as well at Poetry Ireland to talk about the issue. So I think, there's nothing wrong with learning as well. And like for me personally, it was when I was coming up and learning, I suppose, like what to do and where to send poems out. It was men that were really, and if you don't mind me saying, one of those men is in the audience, Billy Collins and Tom McCarthy is here as well. Both of you were, hugely supportive of me when I started writing. So I do struggle with that question as well. I teach, I suppose, contemporary poetry, and if I brought in week after week poems by just men, my students wouldn't stand for it. So I think there's a lot of great work being done by the fired poets as well. There certainly was a moment after that Cambridge Companion came out where we did need to get fired up. But I remember reading in Evan Boland's Object Lessons that when she started writing, the distance between the word poet and the word woman was so huge. And because of the work that she's done, and Nuala and Elaine and Paula, I don't feel that, I never felt that distance. I mean, maybe there will be.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. Also, another dimension, and I'd be interested in hearing your response to is, you're both teachers. Is the teacher always friendly with the poet? Or does the poet fall out with the teacher? Or does the teacher get more time than the poet in your lives? Is there a tension there, or is there harmony there? How does it work for you each?
In my case, I think when I got the job, when I moved down to Cork and I got the job, and one of the new teaching requirements that I had to teach was 17th century poetry, and I'd never taught it before, and it really opened me up to those metres. And I had studied that poetry as an undergrad, but I hadn't absorbed it, Whereas I feel like I kind of internalised some of those rhythms since then. And generally, I think it's all kind of enriching. Actually, it's a positive dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. It is enriching, and I think you have to work at making it enriching at the same time, like bringing in Marie Howe the first time to the classroom, and your mind is blown by those Mary poems. And I don't know, is Sally in the audience? She was the only student from my MA class last year, and just you bring in new poems every week, and I think having other people feed off your excitement. But I also loved not having to worry about money. Do you know what I mean? I probably spent more time worrying about money than I spent writing poems before I got my job at UCC, and being in like UCC, there is this incredible renaissance in terms of creative writing happening, and John is an amazing poet, and bumping into Ailbhe and John and Graham and around the campus, and John Mee and Mary Noonan, and I mean it's a wonderful place to work, and I think ultimately it is enriching.
May I ask you, what is your assessment of the state of health of Irish at the moment?
The language.
The language. I'm not just talking
the
about
language
literature.
question.
I'm not talking about literature. I'm not talking about the politics of Irish. I'm just talking about it. Where is it in its own state of development or otherwise?
So I don't know how many speakers of the language there is. But look, I think Nuala actually referred to this last night. It's evolving, it's changing as languages do. And the syntax is being shaken up a bit and is coming under pressure by English. But there is, a huge amount of goodwill towards the language. It's not easy to deal with the state, the Irish state, through Irish. They make it very difficult for you. But I think the average person that you encounter has a lot of goodwill towards the language, that they're happy that it's been spoken by someone, somewhere, but it doesn't really address the crisis in the Gaeltacht and the Irish-speaking regions, that they need infrastructure, they need broadband, like. And, you know, I'm not from the Gaeltacht and I don't live in the Gaeltacht, but if I don't have the Gaeltacht to go to as a place where you can just speak the language as a social language, and be surrounded by all that rich literary and oral tradition that's there, then there's a huge vacuum, I think, and I know there's some other people writing in Irish here, and I think they would share that fear that if the Gaeltacht doesn't go, you have no well to go to.
Thank you. I'd like to offer anybody who might like to ask a question an opportunity to do so. Is there anybody? Pat? Good man.
Because I think your generation is less pressured than we were by the expectations of tradition. Thomas Kinsella had a very clear idea of what constituted an Irish poem, that being a poem produced by somebody out of Ireland, or whatever language. I'm wondering, Ailbhe, do you notice, I know that the young poets writing in English are being very much influenced now by poetry from other English-speaking countries via the internet. I'm just wondering if the young poets writing in the Irish language are also being influenced by poems from other countries, other languages, other English-speaking countries, as much as the Anglophone poets are.
I think the Inti poets, especially maybe Michael Hartnett, did a lot of the hard work of pushing boundaries linguistically of what is acceptable in a poem. And he was accused of gimmickry at times, even by Sean O'Drisceoil, who thought that maybe he wasn't entirely convinced that it was poetry, because at times it seemed a bit gimmicky. But I think there's a great movement, actually based in Dublin, of spoken word poetry in Irish. It's an event called REC, and it's organised by Ciara Ní and they've also produced these film poems as well, sponsored by the Irish Writers' Centre. So they're definitely influenced by other movements outside of Ireland, and they're doing great work. There's also like a very good hip-hop group called Kneecap from Belfast. I recommend checking them out. They're doing really unusual things with the language, and there's nothing traditional about it. But still, you know, I would maintain that if you're serious about writing in Irish or any language, you know, you get to know the tradition and you go back as far as you can go, and you familiarise yourself with it. That's what I say to the students anyway.
Thank you. Sandra, let me give you this.
Thank you. I'm going to be selfish and ask a craft question. And you can answer generally or with the example of an individual poem, whichever works. I'm curious about one critical phase or moment in your revision process, when you're moving from the initial draft to the poem that we would have heard tonight or this afternoon. What for you is there a turning moment or key moment in your role, not just as a poet, but as a self-editor, as a reviser?
I think what's surprising, maybe for me, every time you feel you're building a poem around one line, like that's the best line that you've ever written in your whole life. And the poem maybe is still not working, but you're still trying to work it around this incredible line that's going to, you know, move people to tears forever and ever. And it's a moment to take that out, and you catch yourself. Do you know what I mean? Like, and you just catch yourself, and I forget it every time. Like, you just get so precious about one line, and So that's always a big learning for me.
I take ages to write a poem, and I think, like a lot of people, it's kind of a rhythm will come to you, and then you're trying to fit things around the rhythm. And once you have the rhythm, you're halfway there, So sometimes you have to surrender to the rhythm and just see what happens.
We have opportunity for another question.
Concerns translation. I always wonder about the process of translation. This question probably is more for Ailbhe, but maybe ask her opinions, the two of you. You mentioned rhythm there. How can you retain rhythm in translation from Irish to English? And do you sometimes have issues with English translations of your work? Do you feel that true to what he wants to say and the form he wants to say it?
I think generally you're just so delighted that someone has taken the time to translate that you, not saying that you're not critical of it, but that feeling of gratitude will kind of outweigh some of those things you mentioned there. So I think it'd be asking a lot for the rhythm to always be maintained in the English translation. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's there part of the way, but that ultimately it's a different poem. And I always feel that the translation is a different poem. And it's not a poem that I've written. So I feel very different even reading the English translations out loud, because they're not my words, and that tonally they might be a little bit different as well. But if I were just to explain the poems to you all in English, it just wouldn't be as effective, So it's like the English translations are so vital for me to speak to you. That it's just overwhelming gratitude is how I feel.